time is brief. There's a lot I would like to cover. So I'll have to keep to a sketchy, rather informal account. We can extend things in the question period. The long-term goal of theoretical inquiry is explanation, not just description. Description is hard enough. Descriptive inquiries seek to show that this is the way things are. Explanation seeks to show why things are this way and not some other way. It's a much more ambitious endeavor, but it is the goal to keep in mind. In the case of language, inquiry proceeds at two levels. One level is concerned with in languages. The second and higher level is concerned with the general faculty of language. I'll just refer to it as FL, faculty of language. FL is the innate endowment that enables a language to be acquired and used. The theory of FL is called universal grammar, UG, traditional term. It's adapted to a new context. At the first level, the study of individual languages, inquiry seeks an adequate grammar of the language, a description of the properties of the language. An adequate grammar must, at the very least, provide a listing, technically a recursive enumeration of the grammatical sentences of the language. Beyond that, it must yield what has been called the basic property of language. Each language is a digital infinity of hierarchically structured expressions, each of which determines, perhaps constitutes a thought, each of which can optionally be externalized in some sensory motor medium. A bold thesis would be that generation of thought by the internal language is entirely separated from externalization, which would be an ancillary process. I'll actually assume this, return to pretty strong reasons to suppose that it's correct. In this conception, the internal language consists of the compositional rules that satisfy the basic property, along with what's called formal semantics, more accurately termed logical syntax, important matter that I'll put aside here. The system for generating thought we can call I language. It's internal, individual, in the technical sense, intentional with an S, meaning we're interested in the actual system coded in the brain, not just one that yields the same output. Well, understood in this way, the study of language conforms to a long tradition from classical Greece, classical India, up through the 19th century. Throughout, the core of the tradition regarded language as fundamentally a system of thought, as audible thought. In the phrase of the 19th century linguist William Dwight Whitney, we know that the restriction to sound is too narrow. This tradition was swept aside in the 20th century by behaviorist and structuralist currents, and it was forgotten. It's still very little known. Modern approaches in the 20th century take language to be at its root a system of communication rather than a system of thought, a system that perhaps evolved from animal communication Recent work seems to me to indicate quite clearly that the tradition was on the right track and should be carried forward. That's a controversial view today, but I think it's justified, and I'll adopt it here. Well, returning to explanation, the task arises only at the higher level. Inquiry into FL, the faculty of language, seems that any human infant can acquire any language with comparable facility. If so, FL is a shared human property. There's also by now substantial evidence that FL is unique to humans, that its fundamental properties have no analog in the animal world. If so, FL is a true species property shared by humans, unique to human essentials. FL must enable any human infant to acquire any language. It's a condition on UG that has been called explanatory adequacy since the 1950s. Sometimes it's called Plato's Problem. It was raised in a certain form by Plato, as it was formulated by Bertrand Russell. It's the problem of how we can know so much given so little evidence. In technical terms of linguistics, it's the problem of poverty of stimulus. In the early days of the generative enterprise in mid-20th century, it was recognized that the poverty of stimulus problem was quite serious, and that standard formulas within behaviorist frameworks will get nowhere. There are contemporary variants with supercomputers and astronomical amounts of data, but they do no better. These early conclusions were established more firmly as serious experimental inquiry was undertaken in later years into language acquisition. It was found that the problem of poverty of stimulus is far more severe than had been assumed. By now, it's been quite solidly established that the knowledge of language of a 2 to 3 year old child goes far beyond what they exhibit in behavior, and also that the gap between data available and knowledge attained is vast, greatly deepens Plato's problem. These results seem to suggest that the faculty of language must be rich enough to yield complex knowledge from impoverished data, very rich, therefore, while at the same time, FL must somehow accommodate the wide variety of languages. It poses a problem. That problem deepens. We turn to another condition that FL must satisfy, sometimes called Darwin's problem. How can FL have evolved under the conditions of human evolution? Though evidence is fragmentary, there are some plausible conclusions about these conditions. Modern humans appeared about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. There's now genomic evidence that the small group of humans began to separate not long after they appeared. All share FL, which was presumably already in place. Prior to the appearance of modern humans, there's virtually no indication of significant symbolic activity in the archaeological record. Not long after their appearance, there's very rich evidence. Note that these numbers are barely a flick of an eye in evolutionary time. Well, all of this suggests that FL appeared in a narrow window of time, pretty much along with modern humans. And there's quite strong evidence that it hasn't changed since. Well, if all that's the case, we expect FL to be very simple. So we therefore face a conundrum. FL must be rich enough to handle Plato's problem, at the same time simple enough to deal with Darwin's problem. And the apparent wide diversity of languages, all determined by FL, lurks in the background. These are basic conditions that be satisfied by UG. The conditions appear to be contradictory, and much of the search for explanatory theory in past years has been guided by this apparent contradiction. For the first time, I think we can now begin to see how the conundrum might be resolved. So let's turn to that. Let's begin with the problem of diversity. That problem would be greatly reduced if diversity of language is sequestered in a particular component of the overall system. The natural place to look is in externalization, excluding the language operations that yield the thought system. That move has initial plausibility. For I language, the POS, the paucity of stimulus problems are overwhelming, generally insurmountable. For externalization, at least there's some direct evidence, what's heard or seen. Though this hasn't been firmly established, research is tending towards showing that the variety, complexity, and easy mutability of language is indeed sequestered in externalization, leaving the system of generative generation of thought relatively fixed. Be completely fixed, we might someday discover that would vindicate an ancient tradition. If this turns out to be true for language, it wouldn't be very surprising. Externalization to some sensory motor medium is not, strictly speaking, language. Rather, it's a combination of the internal system for generation of thought and sensory motor systems that have nothing to do with language. They were in place long before language appeared, haven't changed since. So we might expect that mapping the internal language system into completely unrelated sensory motor systems would be a complex task, solvable in many ways, easily subject to at least superficial change. And so it seems to be. Well, if this is basically correct, then the poverty of stimulus problems reduce largely to externalization. These topics have been the subject of extensive research since the principles and parameters framework was formulated 40 years ago. That was the first approach that offered at least a potential framework for accounting for acquisition of language in a feasible manner. It's been very important work, much of it by the late Ken Hale and his students, which has shown that languages that appear to be radically different are actually cast to the same mold at deeper levels. One high point in this research was Mark Baker's work on showing that on developing a hierarchy of parameters. Another major step forward was later taken by Ian Roberts, who's shown that very simple algorithms based on elementary cognitive principles can feasibly zero in on choice of parameters. He's tested this approach with thousands of languages of great typological variety. I think we can fairly say that the problem of externalization systems is fairly well in hand, at least in principle, partly in practice. And if externalization is the primary, maybe the only locus of variation, a large part of the conundrum is on its way to resolution, namely variability and learnability. Well, to proceed beyond, let's turn to some concrete examples. I'll begin with the most fundamental property of human language, one that is quite surprising in many ways and has rich consequences that are not always sufficiently appreciated. This is the property called structure dependence. Let's briefly review some standard cases. So begin with the operation of construal. For example, finding out what verb phrase an adverb modifies. So take the sentence, the man who fixed the car carefully packed his tools. It's actually ambiguous. Could mean he fixed the car carefully or he carefully packed his tools. Now place the adverb in the front. Carefully, the man who fixed the car packed his tools. It's unambiguous. Can only mean he carefully packed his tools. Actually, that poses a puzzle. The adverb in initial position has to find a verb phrase to modify, but in doing so, we ignore the simplest computation, find the closest verb phrase, which would be fix the car. We reflexively ignore that and choose the more remote verb phrase, packed his tools. It's clear if you think about the structure of the sentence. The phrase packed his tools is actually closer to the adverb than fixed his car, fixed the car in the abstract structure. And that's what we attend to, though we never hear it. There's actually more involved, but that's enough to bring out the basic puzzle. We ignore the simple computation on linear order of words. We reflexively carry out a computation on abstract structure. Let's take a second example. Anaphors, terms that don't refer in themselves, but find an earlier antecedent that determines what they refer to. Well, the simplest algorithm is to seek the closest eligible antecedent, as in sentences like, the boys expect the girls to like each other, means the girls like each other, not the boys. Sometimes, however, that fails, as in sentences like, the friends of the boys like each other. Here it's the friends who like each other, not the boys, the closest antecedent. So once again, we ignore the simplest algorithm, which relies on what we hear, words in linear order, and we use an algorithm that applies to abstract structures, and it's quite complex. First, we have to identify the subject-noun phrase. Then we identify the core element within the noun phrase, choose that as the antecedent. That's what we do reflexively. Final example, take verbal agreement, sentence like, the bombing of the cities is a crime, not are a crime. The bombings of the city are a crime, not is a crime. So again, we reflexively ignore the simplest operation, adjacency, and again carry out an operation that looks quite complex. Construct the abstract structure, subject predicate, locate the head of that structure. That's what we do reflexively. Well, these observations generalize. Structure dependence holds of all constructions in all languages. What that means is that from infancy and on through life, we reflexively ignore 100% of what we hear, words in linear order. We attend only to what we never hear, abstract structures generated by the mind and operations on these structures. Furthermore, experimental work has shown that the principle is known to children as early as they can be tested, 2 years old or less. Notice that this curious property is restricted to I language, the generation of thought. Principle doesn't hold for externalization. Well, the only plausible conclusion is that I language and externalization are distinct systems. For I language, efficient computation ignores what is externalized. Furthermore, all of this must be part of the innately fixed faculty of language, property of UG. This conclusion further supports the thesis that I language, which is language proper, is a system of generation of thought, as was assumed in the millennia-old tradition prior to the behaviorist structuralist revision in the 20th century. Well, it's plain why languages use linear order for externalization. It's required by the speech organs, which cannot produce structures. In fact, sign language, which is the resources of visual space available, does not adhere strictly to linearization. Recall that the sensory motor organs used for externalization are unrelated to language in their nature and evolution. So it's not surprising that language, pure language, ignores the properties that are imposed by these non-linguistic organs. Well, with this in mind, we can turn to the why questions. Why does UG force structure dependence? The optimal answer would be that this follows from the simplest forms of UG, using the simplest operation for generating expressions. The simplest operation is unbounded binary set formation. It's the basis for what's called merge in the literature. And in fact, structure dependence does follow directly from merge. So to put it metaphorically, when Mother Nature created language, she found the simplest possible solution, which is, incidentally, the way evolution works generally, all of science, so it appears. It's a driving intuition of science, since Galileo, it's by now so broadly verified that Einstein called it the miracle creed that guides all serious inquiry. In case of language, it's called the strong minimalist thesis. Reliance on merge as the sole structure building operation has many other crucial empirical consequences. Won't be able to go into it in the time available, but there's a fair amount in the literature. Reliance on merge as the sole structure building operation yields the core of the basic property, generating an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions. We need only add that the primitive elements of the system are elementary concepts. Elaborated by merge, these become phrases. We can translate straightforwardly to event semantics. These would be the syntactic exponents of participants in events. Program along these lines, if it can be fully carried out, would complete the theory of generation of thought. Should add that the evolutionary origin of the most elementary concepts that have to serve as primitives is a complete mystery and will probably remain so. There are no analogs in the animal world, no record of their development. Well, there are two logical possibilities for merge of X and Y. Either the two are distinct or one is part of the other. Technically, it's called a term of the other. The two options are called external and internal merge. External merge yields combination, as in read books. Internal merge yields displacement, as in which books did he read, where which books is understood to be the object of read. The strong minimalist thesis should not permit an operation of deletion, which would allow far richer systems. In externalization, deletion does take place within narrow conditions, but that does not apply to I language, which we may therefore assume has no deletion operations. That has consequences. So take again simple cases like which books did you read? The I language representation is which books did you read, which books, which is interpreted directly as for which books X, you read the books X. So merge automatically yields the phenomenon of displacement with reconstruction. It's a topic that's been extensively studied. It falls out directly from the optimal system of generation, just as structure dependence does. What reaches our mind in this case is which books did you read which books, but which reaches the ear and reaches consciousness is which books did you read. Externalization removes all but one occurrence, which has to remain to indicate that the operation took place. That's a general economy condition, radically reducing both mental computation and execution of articulatory motions. Actually, the result of these simple operations to maximize computational efficiency yield problems for perception and parsing, what are called filler gap problems. The parser finds a WH phrase like which books, and it has to find a gap that fills it for interpretation. Turns out to be quite complex, one of the major problems in parsing. The problem would be radically reduced if the gap were filled, but Mother Nature didn't care about that when designing language. She insisted on finding the most elegant solution, even though it poses difficulties for language use, quite serious ones. The sentences become more complex. This is one of many cases in which computational efficiency conflicts with communicative efficiency. In all cases, communicative efficiency is sacrificed. It's more evidence for the traditional conception of language as fundamentally a system of thought. All of this is consistent with how evolution proceeds quite generally. Schematically, we can distinguish three stages. First, some disruption takes place, maybe a mutation or drift or gene transfer, or a bacterium accidentally swallowing another microorganism. That's the breakthrough that led to complex cells. That's why we're not all bacteria. The second stage is reconstruction. Nature reconstructs the new entity in the simplest way, observing the miracle creed, paying no attention to how the new entity might be used. The third stage is winnowing. The outcomes that reproduce more effectively prevail. That's natural selection. Well, that suggests a reasonable scenario for language evolution. First, some minor rewiring of the brain took place, yielded the new property of recursive enumeration. Next step is reconstruction. Nature devises the simplest, most elegant way to organize the new system. Strong minimalist thesis. Semantic theory becomes available, possibly with more primitive origins. Computational procedures are given, part of natural law. The winnowing stage is never reached, possibly because of lack of time, possibly because the optimal system is so delicately designed that it's either all or none. So we're approaching an interesting conclusion. Internal language might be perfect and a common human possession. That's the strong minimalist thesis proposed 25 years ago. It was not then regarded as realistic, rather as a long-term goal that might guide research. Recent work does suggest something more audacious. Thesis might indeed be true, as evolutionary theory leads us to suspect, along with science generally, and as empirical inquiry increasingly suggests. Well, there's a lot more to talk about, many other possibilities, but I don't think there's time to talk about it here. Crucial point is that the internal language seems to keep to the strong minimalist thesis throughout, with no departure necessary, even for pretty complex cases. Well, remains to show how far we can extend such reasoning. Needless to say, that's an extremely challenging task. Nothing like it has ever arisen in the study of language and thought. There are promising early steps far beyond what could have been imagined just a few years ago. Final remark, strong minimalist thesis has several functions. One is a disciplinary function, sharply restricts the options for description and thus deepens explanation. It also has an enabling function. It provides options for what iLanguage might be, for what kinds of subsystems might exist. An interesting question, just coming into focus, is to explore whether iLanguages make use of all the possibilities that are enabled by the strong minimalist thesis, which may be more than just a guideline for inquiry, as assumed in the past, but may actually express a fundamental truth about the nature of language and thought, the most distinctive possessions of this strange species of ours. Thank you.